As to Ivy Hall, and I can't think of a better place to hold a talk on beauty than Ivy Hall. And I'd like to thank John Haas. I talked to him earlier today, had a dinner appointment with the Prince of the Two Sicilies. I didn't know there were two Sicilies anymore. He's here. But he's with us in spirit. And it's a moment for me, you know, coming back to Philadelphia. I grew up here. Watched it go down the drain. Wrote books about it. Probably accelerated it going down the drain. But it's all in the past, okay? Because now we're going to talk about something completely different. We're going to talk about beauty. In 1879, a Spanish nobleman by the name of Marcelino Sanz de Sotolo was busy cataloging the detritus at the entrance of a cave on his property when he heard a call from his 8-year-old daughter, who had wandered farther into the kilometer-long cavern. Instead of following the example of her father and examining the floor of the cave, Sotolo's daughter looked up and discovered that she was in what looked like a large hall whose ceiling was covered with paintings of now extinct animals. In 1880, Sotolo published a report on his discovery, expecting acclaim, but his breves apuntes sobre algunos objetos prehistóricos de la provincia de Santander, or notes on some prehistoric objects in the Santander region, was immediately attacked by a group of French archaeologists who accused Sotolo of fraud, reasoning that cavemen were not capable of the artistic sophistication exhibited in the Altamira caves. It was not until 22 years after his publication appeared, and a number of years after his death, that Sotolo found posthumous vindication when a Monsieur de Catillac, a French archaeologist, published Les Cavernes pour les Dessins, La Grotte Altamira, Espagne, Mea culpa d'un sceptique. From that moment, the cave paintings of Altamira gained a key place in international research into prehistoric art. By 1922, caveman had become such an established figure in the modern that's another one of those paintings. Caveman had become such a such an established figure in the modern mind that H.G. Wells dedicated the beginning of his history of the world to fanciful speculation on the details of his life, which was long on promoting sexual primitivism, but short on describing the one thing we knew about the cavemen who actually lived in Altamira, which was their art. G.K. Chesterton, who studied at the Slade School in London and could tell from experience the actual skill that went into the cave paintings, expressed his frustration at Wells' materialism by claiming in The Everlasting Man that the simplest lesson we can derive from the newly discovered European cave paintings is that art is the signature of man. Art is a manifestation of rationality which renders man uniquely separate from nature. Because of that distance, man can represent nature in ways that are abstract, symbolic, and representative. The image Chesterton used to convey that rationality was the mirror. Reindeer man could draw, but the reindeer couldn't. Because man possessed a mind that is like a mirror. The human mind, Chesterton continues, is like a mirror because it is truly a thing of reflection. It is like a mirror because in it alone all other shapes can be seen like shining shadows in the vision. Above all, it is like a mirror because it is the only thing of its kind. Other things may resemble it or resemble each other in various ways. Other things may excel it or excel each other in various ways. Just as the furniture in a table may be round like a mirror, or a cupboard may be larger than a mirror, but the mirror is the only thing that can contain them all. Man is the microcosm. Man is the measure of all things. Man is the image of of God. These are the only real lessons to be learned in the cave. The word Plato used to refer to the mind's ability to reflect upon what the eye sees is mimesis. Mimesis means imitation. Art is imitation of nature. That's all it is. That's all it will ever be. Never going to be. And Aristotle got it right. It is never going to change. Now, the Altamira cave paintings are one of the earliest examples of art as mimesis. Let's move on here. Next. They're cavemen. Remember cavemen?
Oh, gotcha. I got thrown off by the...
We're a little bit behind here. We're going to catch up. There's the mirror. Go ahead. All right, stop here. This is a cave painting, okay? But at a certain point, we're talking about language. And we're talking about language. If you go to the earliest language that we know, it was often picture painting. And that's precisely what that is there. So they're called hieroglyphics. Maybe this was the first language. Because this is a significant fact here, that why did H.G. Wells get everything completely wrong? There's a one-word answer to that, and it's called evolution, which completely screwed up the English mind for over a century now, and the American mind, insofar as we speak English and adopt the English attitudes. There's one man who talked about this in an intelligent way, and it was Joseph Ratzinger, who was talking about the first man. Now we know the first man was Adam, but he goes into it in a much deeper fashion, because he says, what is the essence of man? The essence of man is logos. Logos is speech. Painting and speech and art are all manifestations of logos. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight, because when we're talking about beauty, beauty is a transcendental. There are three transcendentals: the good, the true, and the beautiful. And they all lead you to the same thing, which is their characteristics of being, their characteristics of God. Logos is God. That's what St. John said in the prologue of his gospel. So there are moments in history, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight, where sometimes the artist can portray what the philosopher cannot explain. Because beauty can lead you to the same place, but it leads you by a different path. But if we get back to Logos, Pope Benedict believes that the beginning of mankind was identical with man's utterance of the first word. And this is what he said: the clay became man at the moment in which a being for the first time was capable of forming, however dimly, the thought of God. The first thou, that however stammeringly was said by human lips to God, marks the moment in which the Spirit arose in the world. Herein lies the reason why the moment of anthropogenesis cannot possibly be determined by paleontology. Anthropogenesis is the rise of the Spirit, which cannot be excavated with a shovel. That's what we're talking about here. I wrote a book called Logos Rising. This is the sequel to that book, because this is beauty rising in some sense. But if you take language at the beginning of man, it can't evolve. It cannot evolve. Language cannot evolve. Because there was a time when, as he said, when the first man spoke the first word, he probably spoke to God and said something to God. But then when he spoke the second word, it was to his wife. It was to Eve. Now, you can't evolve into a situation like that. So what was the first word that Adam said to Eve? Hi, how are you? And Eve would say, fine, how are you? What else can they say? The point is that there is no possibility that two people could evolve on separate evolutionary tracks and develop the same language. This is the beginning of Logos in human history, and this is a manifestation of it, and art is the other manifestation of that Logos. Let's go forward here. There's that cutie. This is the villain's door Venus. An equally early form of mimesis. Now, you probably figured out that this is not a graphic representation of the typical woman in a hunter-gatherer society that lived in Austria 30,000 years ago. For an example of what hunter-gatherers look like, I recommend the Namibian hunter-gatherer in Sao Paulo, and I can't do it, but they don't click in their language. It's in The Gods Must Be Crazy. So the whole point of The Gods Must Be Crazy is he looks at her and he says, God, I can't marry her. It would take forever to feed that woman. I can't gather enough. So if we go back to the villain's door of Venus, this is not a photo. This is a representation of I'm assuming a man did it. It's the essence of what a woman is and what a woman can do, which is basically she can bear children and she can nurse children. And everything else is sort of takes a back seat to that understanding. You couldn't take a picture. You had to use the mind, in other words, to come up with this representation. And the other thing that's significant is that the lady has no face. She's got very pronounced genitalia, but she's got no face, which is a sign that consciousness had not yet arisen here. This will also have resonance when we get to Titian. Plato's idea of mimesis was based on an understanding of nature in which the world was divided between the sublunary realm of becoming, which was characterized by constant change, and the superlunary realm of forms, which never changed. Knowledge meant discovering a form which could be apprehended only by the mind. The human eye could not see form. So those forms, there's a form of the bed. And so the artisan, understanding what a bed is in his mind, imposes that form on wood and whatever else you need to make a bed. And that's pretty much the Platonic understanding of art. Okay? Now the painter comes along, he paints the bed. So it's twice removed from reality. Well, it's not really important then, is it? Plato did not have a high opinion of art. He felt that Socrates felt that certain poetry should be banned because it led to impiety, because you're constantly listening to where Zeus is having some affair with a cow or something like that. So he didn't like this idea, but what you had here was the Platonic understanding of art. And so the Platonic understanding would basically be, you take a form, let's say like a triangle, a square, or whatever, and you impose it on matter. So let's say stone, so you get a triangle-shaped stone. You get a pillar, which is a circle, a long circle, and you put the pillar up there, and then you get a rectangle, you put it on top of those pillars, and you have a beam, and then you put the triangle on top of that, and you have a temple. So a Greek temple is basically a Platonized cave. Now, this is not only what we're talking about here. That's the Parthenon. That's what I just described. Okay? There's the pillar, there's the rectangle, there's the triangle. Very simple. Okay? And the problem is, it's so simple that it completely dominated Western thought for a millennium at least, for over a millennium and a half. Now, it's not quite that simple because what we're talking about is Plato as someone who understood Pythagoras, and Pythagoras understood numbers, and he felt that forms were numbers, and that the world was made up of numbers. Now, we have, numbers, we know what numbers are, but he had a deeper understanding of numbers. He had a kind of metaphysical understanding of numbers. So one, what does one mean? Well, one is unity. Unity is God. So the one is God. Two is diversity. It's multiplicity. It's more than one, so it can't be divine. So therefore, it's nature. It's nature. Okay? Now you go to 3. And what is 3? 3 is 1 plus 2. So if you add unity to diversity, you get beauty. That is the essence of what beauty is. That's the essence of what creation is. You didn't use the word creation. And one way to understand this would be with ratios. He also talked about ratios. And one of the most significant ratios is known as the golden ratio. So I was in a parking lot in Missoula, Montana, and a woman came up to me and she said, "Your hair is beautiful." So why did she say that? Okay, first reason, she was drunk. She just come from a concert. Anyway, second reason is my hair is beautiful. And why is my hair beautiful? Because you can see the golden ratio of where I part my hair. Now, why did I decide to part my hair that way? Because I thought it looked good. So there is an objective nature to beauty. And one of the things that is objectively beautiful is the golden ratio. So if you go to the next, there's that lady. Okay.
Oh, that was.
Okay, so what you're talking about here is, oh, I get it now. The Parthenon, why do we find that attractive? Because it's a manifestation of the golden ratio. And also, you can see the geometrical figures as part of this whole thing. We see a building, but what we understand is that there's an order to that building that is somehow a cosmic order, and we understand it as beautiful, and that's how we understand. That's our introduction to this cosmic order. So the beauty we perceive when viewing the Parthenon is governed by the relationship between the side and the diagonal in a series of squares. Each of the squares exists in relationship to the larger square, enclosing it in the ratio of 1 to 1.25, 1 to 25. Therefore, the whole proportional system is based on the functional relationship of the square of 2 to 1 to 1.25, or 5/4. This ratio is known as the golden ratio, or 5, and it was divine because, like God, it contains within itself both identity and difference. It's both 1 and 2. The golden ratio so what we're seeing here, in many ways, is an inchoate understanding of the Trinity. Now, the one thing that Plato did not know, and Aristotle did not know, is that God created, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. They thought the world was eternal. And because it was eternal, there was no creator. And if there's no creator, well, there's no mind behind its inception. So when you have the idea of creation, which is the first sentence in Genesis, suddenly the universe becomes a work of art. Because it was made by someone. And if it becomes a work of art, you can study the universe, and you can, through the universe, studying the universe, you can come to some understanding of the mind of God. And that's what we mean by a transcendental. You can have access to the mind of God. Now, if you read Logos Rising, you know that I feel that St. Paul gave the wrong speech at the Areopagus. I know this is presumptuous of me. Maybe someday I'll get to talk to St. Paul, but it's pretty clear he gave the wrong speech. He showed up in Athens. The Areopagus was a philosophical society, and he gave the Ephesus speech, which is basically about idol worship. Ephesus was run by silversmiths. They made idols, they made all their money. The economy revolved on idols, silver idols. And you're talking now to philosophers, they don't worship idols. They're So he said, I got something I have to tell you. St. Paul's always a man in a hurry. I need to talk to you about Jesus. And Jesus was a man who came to save you. And he died, they killed him, and he rose from the dead. And at that point, everybody says, oh, okay. Well, we'll talk about this some other time. And they walked out. He gave the wrong speech. Now, I think there's one man who knew that he gave the wrong speech, and I think it was St. John, the evangelist, who was living in Ephesus at the time with the Blessed Mother. And I think he wrote his gospel understanding the failure of that speech and also understanding that the world is now moving and we have to talk to the Greeks. And there's no point talking to the Greeks about Hebrew genealogies, like the house of David. They've never heard of these dudes. Okay, they don't know who they are. They could care less about them. So what does St. John do? He said, he had Genesis in mind. In the beginning there was heaven and earth. But he was writing in Greek. And so he knew there was a whole vocabulary of philosophical terms. And so he said, in the beginning there was Logos. Now we say in the beginning was the Word. And I couldn't figure that out. I don't know what that means. But until I studied Greek at this institution down the street here, I realized that Logos was much more than that. Logos is the order of the universe. And he said, in the beginning there was Logos. There was never a time when there was chaos. There was always some type of order from the beginning. No matter what beginning you talk about, there was order because, and then he gets to the punchline. Logos is God. So now it's not just geometry, it's a person. And this person can now make sure that this plan takes place in history. It's not just, oh, you're studying geometry and you got all these figures here and all that. That's great. But what's that got to do about me and what's that got to do about history? Because this is dynamic now. And now the Logos can move forward in history. Now, as I said, there's a guy, I quote him in the book, who says basically that the golden proportion, the Logos, which was now associated with the Son, was both God and with God, which meant that Logos could act as a mediator between heaven and earth in a way that was analogous to the golden ratio, or 5, which is a 3-term continuous proposition in which the third term is equal to the first term plus the second term. A is to B as B is to A plus B. So that actually only 2 terms A are involved in that 3-term proposition. That's the golden ratio. It's also the Trinity. And so if let's a thought experiment. Suppose St. Paul had said, okay, all right, you don't know who these Hebrew dudes are. Let's go to the Parthenon and there. Does that make sense to you? Do you see what's going on there? Because this is Logos, and Logos is God. Now that might have been a beginning of a whole different thing. As it was, Christianity didn't land in Athens until 600 years later. Paul discussed it with the philosophers, and it comes out in the next epistle, which is Epistle to the Corinthians. So the hell with the philosophers. I'm going to Corinth, which is a seaport, and I'm going to talk to sailors and prostitutes. And there he says, you know, I have no wisdom. All I have is Christ and Him crucified. Well, okay, that's good. But this is still important. And you still missed an opportunity because this is going to be a vehicle for Logos in human history as well. And oftentimes, the point I want to make tonight is the artist can portray what the philosopher cannot understand. How many times have you had the emotion, the experience of a piece of music that just transported you to a different realm, removed you in the depths of my apostasy? I heard Handel's Messiah, and it got me up out of the chair and walked to the door of a church. But I didn't go in. It took a little longer than that. But at least it moved me out of my chair. This is the power, the beauty. That's beauty. That's what beauty has. Or the opposite. I go to the Taj Mahal in India. You have to walk. There's a camel cart, and you have to walk there. You walk through this big, enormous gate, and you stand there, and you see everything all at once. It's like an explosion of beauty, because the temple, it's a tomb, it's in exactly the right place, it's beautiful, it's in the exact right situation with the garden, and you just want to stand there, and you just think, I don't have to do anything else. I can just sit here, stand here and look at this thing. That's the situation. Now, as I said, this was so powerful. What Plato's understanding was so powerful that it crippled the development of art in Europe. For 1,000 years, everyone was a Platonist. Aristotle came late, got him through the Greeks, got him through the Arabs. Aquinas was reading the translation from the Rubens. There was something, it was holding everybody back. And the man who understood this was Vasari, who wrote the history of art in Italy. And he begins with Johto. This is the Arena Chapel. And what he said about Johto is that Johto broke with Greek models. Now, I think the Greek model he's talking about is the icon. And if you remember the icon, it's a straightforward, full-face view of some saint or blessed mother, God, whatever. And the background's gold. And the background is gold because gold is eternal. It never changes. Okay? And that's it. And so at a certain point, the idea changed. It took about, what are we talking about here? Maybe 1300, 1200, 1300. So it took about 1,000 years, which is the time that they discovered the Trinity, 1,000 years to understand the implications of creation for art. That's what we're talking about here. The world was created, which means it's a work of art. This means that there aren't two realms, where ideas and flux, idea, flux, stasis, flux, and they'll never come together. It's a different situation. And at this point, the man who understood the implications of this was almost a contemporary of Johto, and I'm talking about Thomas Aquinas. Now, Aquinas perfected Aristotle. Aristotle broke with Plato because he said there are no separated forms. The form is in the thing itself. It's called intellect. Aquinas took that idea and combined it with the idea, a Christian idea of creation, and he came up with a whole new explanation. Aquinas perfected Aristotle. In 1306, which is to say roughly 30 years after Aquinas died, Johto painted frescoes on the wall of the Arena Chapel. At that point, that's the Arena Chapel, if you go back there. And what you see here, it's hard to tell because these are not, pictures, but what you're seeing here is the background isn't gold anymore. There's something going on here. Vasari mentions that he did an illustration of Christ in the boat. And suddenly you have these pictures, you've got the drama of the scripture now in the art. And the apostles are terrified because of the storm. You have much more drama, you have much more intimate connection with the psychological issues that are going on here. This is what Johto did, and I'm saying he did it because of Aquinas. Now we don't know, probably did Johto read Aquinas? He could have. He apparently did a portrait of Aquinas, but we don't know. And I'm saying in many ways, it doesn't matter. Because when you're talking about the realm of ideas, if an idea gets out, it gets out into the ether, and it spreads around, and people don't, it's like the leaven in the loaf. Remember that? How does the kingdom of God spread? Well, no one knows. You put the loaf down there, the dough is that size, you come back in the morning and it's that size, so you don't know how it spread. Well, this is an idea that spread. What was this idea? Aquinas reversed Platonic aesthetics. Okay? The Greeks, they never used the terms like existence and essence, which is what Aquinas used, but they were implicit in Plato and Aristotle's understanding of the world as made up of matter and form. According to this theory, the real world was made up of forms or essences which are timeless. The mind could gain access to the world of forms by apprehending things like numbers or geometrical shapes, and then impose them through art on the world of flux because it was always changing. The last example was the temple that we already talked about. Aquinas changed all that. Now, he never wrote a treatise on aesthetics, but he wrote a treatise on being. And in that, he said, existence is the form which calls essence into being. In a true sense, then, the most normal, that is, most perfective element of substance is existence and not substantial form. Complete reversal. He could do that because God created heaven and earth. And it wasn't meaningless flux. And there is logos in nature. There's never been a time where there wasn't logos, and logos is suffused with nature. And at this point, you could sit down, and if you studied nature, you could come up with a form. Nature, existence, gave birth to the form. It's completely different. And that is the beginning of the greatest period of art in world history. And I'm talking about Italy from the time of Johto up to Pietro and Aquinas, 1947. It never stopped. It's still there. It's still there. By the way, his most famous, I think his most famous portrait is the portrait of Queen Elizabeth, who just died. Brilliant, beautiful portrait. Okay, this changed the world. Okay? So I'm trying to think, what was it like? I tried to explain this to a bunch of teenagers from Missouri. And one of them said to me, terrain precedes the map. That's exactly right. The terrain precedes the map. The map does not precede the terrain. That would be Plato. Now the terrain precedes the map. You derive the form from existence. Okay? Now, part of the shock that came to me when I'm doing this book is I start reading Etienne Gilson and Jacques Maritain, the two most famous Thomists of the 20th century, people who were very influential in my life. And I started reading Gilson's Aesthetics. Gilson was known as a Thomist. When it comes to aesthetics, he's Platonist because he says that being is known as matter when it is determined, and as a form when it does the determining. This is the exact opposite of Aquinas said. So he's a Thomist and he doesn't understand Thomas Aquinas. Maritain said the same thing. Gilson succumbed to what we will call formalism, which is a perennial danger in art criticism. And we'll talk about it a little bit later on. But this is what he said. He said, he said, there is no difference whatever between representational and abstract art. That's Etienne Gilson saying that. So wait a minute. You're saying there's no difference between the Pietà and Jack the Dripper? Abstract expressionism? Yes, that's exactly what he's saying. He was influenced by French Impressionism, I think badly, if he was a French patriot or chauvinist, depending on how you want to talk about it, and he was influenced by this. So he goes on to say, even considered in themselves and apart from any possible signification, straight lines, angles, diagonals, triangles, rectangles, curved circles, spirals, in short, all possible geometrical figures are in themselves form and consequently are definite objects. Abstract painters and representational painters are likewise creating forms and by the same token beings. So there's no difference between abstract art. Well, no, wait a minute, that's wrong. Okay? He goes on to say the classical position, according to which, he affirms the classical position, according to which existence comes to things through form. That's the exact opposite of what Aquinas said. Aquinas said existence calls essence into being. He's saying the exact opposite. Form cannot confer being. Only existence can confer being. He didn't understand that. Okay? Now, there's one man who did understand. It was Umberto Eco. He's famous for that novel he wrote, which was made into a horrible movie. But he said that the medieval painters who preceded Johto never discovered how to connect their metaphysical concepts with beauty with their knowledge of artistic techniques, leaving them in two distinct and unrelated worlds. And the best example of that I can give is a medieval illustration of Adam and Eve in a book called the Theological de Duc de Berry, which was created between 1413 and 1416. Now this is a page in that book. Now, I can go into, if you read the book, and I think you should read the book, as a matter of fact, you're not getting out of here until you buy it. You will see there is a long, formalistic explanation by Boileau of what's going on in this picture. And it's basically all revolves around the use of the compass. So there's obviously a circle here, obviously. But then we have the story of Adam and Eve. Now the story begins up here. This is Eve taking the apple. And then it moves counterclockwise. Down here we have Eve giving the apple to Adam. Now actually, this is Adam and Eve being wedded by God, leads to that, down to here. And then it comes around here, and here we are, Adam and Eve are being expelled from paradise. Okay, that's great. But you've got two completely different realms, just as exactly what Umberto Eco said. So you've got geometry, and you've got the Bible, but they're completely different. And the one doesn't help the other at all. Like, what's the focal point of this thing? In my humble opinion, there is no focal point. The focal point, as far as I can see, is, okay, this is architecture. That's great. But what's it doing there? I don't know. There's other architecture. There's obviously logos going into this thing. There's obviously all sorts of calculations. And if you read the book, you can see how complicated these calculations were. But as a work of art, it's a failure. Because the eye finds no corresponding visual correlative or focus in the painting itself. So this is before Johto. This is the Middle Ages. They knew about geometry, they knew about the compass, they knew about all this type of stuff. They knew about Adam and Eve, they knew about creation, they knew all these things, but they couldn't put them together. Okay, then we have Johto. And then we have something even more significant, which is Pietro della Francesco. Now this is the baptism of Christ. Now, first thing you probably noticed here is the golden ratio. Right there. The second thing you probably noticed is John is baptizing Jesus Christ. Yes, that is the focal point. It's clearly the focal point of this thing. That's what this thing is about. And so we have a kind of unification now of geometry and story in a way that we did not have before that. So we're getting now to a fundamental principle of beauty. What is beauty? Beauty is existence and essence taken together. And when you see beauty, you see a complete fusion of what is organized and what is real. So it's not geometry. It's not like looking out the window, because that's real, but it's not organized. It's a combination of both. And when we have this kind of maximal apprehension, simultaneous apprehension of both essence and existence, we call it beauty. Now, if you take this to a theological level, God is absolute existence and He's absolute essence. And when we die, if we die and go to heaven, we will contemplate absolute essence and absolute existence, and it's known as the beatific vision. And it will be so beautiful and so powerful that we will be able to contemplate that for eternity. Do you see the connections here? Do you see the transcendental motion here? Here's the geometry that we're talking about. Okay? Oh, I get it. It's triangles and circles. We're back to Pythagoras, remember? The circle is 1. That's unity. The triangle is 3. That's unity plus diversity. And then we have, what's the center? What's the mediator between eternity and time? Between heaven and earth? It's Jesus Christ. He is what Plato would have called the demi-orgos. Okay? The demi-orgos, this resolves the conflict at the heart of Greek philosophy, where we have Plato, who said God is the demi-orgos, which means He operates in time. But wait a minute, if you're operating in time, you're not eternal, so you're not God. Aristotle, on the other hand, said the uncaused cause and the unmoved mover was God. Well, that's true, because that is eternal, but who is He? And does He care about me? And he's in eternity and I'm in time. So what you have here is the resolution of that with the Trinity. Because Jesus Christ is true God and true man. And so what you're seeing here is a manifestation of that fact. So, there's the Holy Spirit at the apex of the triangle, which is a symbol of the Trinity. God's up there. You can't see God. Okay? But he's up there. So the straight line goes down here, and there we have Jesus Christ. And here is the circle which is unity, comes around here, and it goes right through his navel. And his navel is a symbol of his humanity. And here we have a graphic representation of how Jesus Christ is both the eternal Logos and true God and true man. Now, when you look at that painting, you understand this intuitively. And I'm saying this was the moment in history. By the time that Pietro del Francesco is doing his paintings, nobody knew who Aquinas was. Aquinas had been completely eclipsed. He was replaced by William of Ockham, who introduced a completely corrosive philosophy known as nominalism, which was then scholastic philosophy, which basically turned God into an Islamic God of pure will, and you couldn't know anything about it. And the main manifestation, the prime student of William of Ockham was Martin Luther, because everybody learned nominalism when they were being taught in the seminary. So what I'm saying here is that insight that I told you of Aquinas, of being, existence calls essence into being, is only being carried forward by art. You can't find it in the philosophical school. It's there waiting to be rediscovered. By the time we have the Thomist Revival, which is 1850, let's say, we're here at 1350. 500 years, Aquinas is complete eclipse here. But the idea is being carried forward by art. Okay. Another step forward. Now this is Titian. Okay? Titian came after Pietro del Francesco. Titian knew everything that Del Francesco knew about composition and circles and triangles. Every single artist, by this point, we're talking about the middle of the 16th century, they knew that because this is a tradition that got passed on from one artist to another. You went to work at an atelier, and they knew this. They knew the geometry. This is not a big deal anymore. We all know geometry, and so what does Titian do? He takes mimesis in a completely different direction, where we have now psychological drama. Art can be a vehicle for psychological drama. And here we have a prime example of psychological drama. So again, we've got, there's the golden ratio. And there's the background. This is, Johto told you can put a background in there. You're situating this thing in nature. Nature has been redeemed now. But now, so what happened here? We have Jesus Christ rising from the dead, and the first person who meets him is Mary Magdalene. And you have an incredibly sophisticated drama going on here right now. So basically, here's Mary Magdalene. She was a prostitute, so she was no stranger to carnal love. And here is her Lord and Savior. She loves her Lord and Savior. So what is the first instinct that you have when you're going with someone you love? You want some type of unity, and generally that means sexual unity. Okay, so what's she doing? She's reaching for his genitals. Okay? And he's putting up a hand like that and blocking that gesture, that intention of hers. And when he blocks that, her eyes go up. And her eyes go up, and now they're looking at the heart. And so what you have here is an allegory of sacred and profane love. And so what has to happen here is this sexual impulse. It's not bad, but it has to be sublimated into something higher. And so carnal love now becomes divine love, love of God. That's what's happening. This is a brilliant psychological study. I mean, it's brilliant. I showed, I got all enthused about this, so I'm running around showing this picture to everyone. And I showed it to a Muslim lady from Afghanistan who was studying at Notre Dame. And I gave that explanation. She said, I think you're crazy. That's not the picture. That's all in your mind. You shouldn't say that. You've got a dirty mind. That was pretty much the gist of what she said. Now, why did she say that? Well, she said because she's a Muslim. And Muslims are not allowed to do images. I've been all over Iran. I've seen beautiful mosques. They have beautiful tiles. They have beautiful patterns in the ceiling. When I was taken to the mosque in Isfahan, which is one of those beautiful, and the guy who's taking me around takes me to a rug shop. And he sits me down and says, pick any rug. So I'm staring at a rug that is made out of silk, and it is a replica of the ceiling of the mosque. And I thought, that is the most beautiful thing I ever see. And stupidly, I said, well, you pick one. I said, no, I want that one. That one, I don't care how much it costs. I want that one. So he gave me a bath mat from Baluchistan. But she was not educated. She was not educated enough in art where you can use art by dealing with these intimate issues and not be dragged down by concupiscence. You're not dragged down into some type of sensual dead end. It's sublimated, it's higher. And the higher, when you sublimate that art, it becomes a kind of beauty. Okay, now this was the crisis that Titian's involved in at this point. Because, let's go to the next one. That was an optimistic painting. This is a pessimistic painting. So what's going on here? Who is this chubby chick here? That's Venus, the goddess of love. Okay? Now we have the exact opposite going on here now, because what is happening to Titian? He has gotten so good at mimesis that he can paint naked ladies that look actually real. The problem is when you do that really effectively, you can arouse concupiscence. And there are people here in Venice at this point who are actually interested in that type of sexual arousal. So this is a portrait of his dilemma. This is the artist here. And the artist is symbolized by the organ. The organ is music. Music, remember Pythagoras? All those musical ratios, that's exactly what Pythagoras was talking about. So here we have the artist at this point in history. He's got one hand on the keyboard, and what's he looking at? Well, he's not looking at her face. I can tell you that. He's completely distracted by the sensual nature of the beauty that he sees in the female body, and he's looking at her crotch. Okay? And she is disappointed. She's looking at a dog. The dog is the symbol of passion. She's the goddess of beauty. And it's a warning. It's a warning. We're heading in the wrong direction here. Think of me. I got all these rich guys that want me to do pornography. And I'm stuck in the middle. I'm trying to do beauty. They want pornography. What am I supposed to do? I'm getting distracted. And that's exactly what the musician has happened here. That's what's going on here. So there's a crisis over the horizon. What's the next picture? Now, this is, again, the same type of thing, except it's you now. You're the center of attraction. Of course, she's looking right at you. Remember the Willem-Dorf Venus? Remember? The one she had great breasts but no face. Okay? Well, this is a lady who's got both. And she's looking right at you. And the question is, what's it going to be? Again, psychological drama here. What's it going to be? Is it going to be sacred or profane love? Is it going to be monogamy? Is it going to be holy marriage, holy matrimony, or is it going to be fornication? Because both possibilities, they're both possible here. This is his portrayal of that dilemma. This is sacred versus profane love. Which is it going to be? We have been redeemed because of Jesus Christ. We can see the heavenly city up there if you follow sacred love. But it's an open question now. We don't know. We're heading into uncharted waters here. Okay? Now, This is Titian's best friend. It's Pietro Aretino. Titian did the portrait of Pietro Aretino. He's obviously a contemporary. He's living in Venice. Venice is the capital of the world right now. It is the cultural Italy. If you want to know where Italy was at that time, read Shakespeare. Shakespeare is in awe of Italy. Okay, everything. It's the center of everything. And Venice is the center of commerce. They invented double-entry bookkeeping there. The Germans, like the Fuggers, are all coming down to study business. And Aretino's there, and he is the best-selling author in Venice at the time. He publishes letters. He's a poet, and he also has the distinction of being the first pornographer. Okay, he wrote a series of pornographic sonnets, which is okay, but pornography is always a function of technology, and the new technology here was the book, the printed book. Gutenberg's printing press had been invented. It had been imported to Venice, and Venice was leading the world in the production of books. So now what you did was he collaborated with a guy whose name Raimondi. One of those princes I was talking about, the Duke of Mantua, had a pleasure palace, and he painted pornographic frescoes around one of his rooms. Raimondi took those, copied them, and cut them into wood blocks, put the wood block in a book, and now you have the pornographic sonnet, and you have the pornographic picture to go with it. Okay? They were immediately banned. The guy who did it was thrown in jail. But there's something out in, as I said, it's in the ether right now. So let's go to the next picture. This is the Sistine Chapel. Now, Michelangelo is younger than these guys. He's influenced by all of these currents going on. And he's been commissioned to do sacred art. This was incredibly controversial at the time. Okay? And one of the people who was most offended by Michelangelo's frescoes in the Sistine Chapel was Aretino. He's a pornographer, and he's offended by what Michelangelo put on the wall because there's all of this nudity. Other people were offended. The cardinals, a lot of cardinals. Federico Borromeo, the cousin of Carlo Borromeo, the famous seminary is right down the street here. He was offended. Now, what are we talking about here? Why are we offended? Is it the human body? No, nudity is not per se offensive, but it's a chapel. And it might be distracting to have these naked bodies on the wall when you're trying to attend Mass. Maybe that's not the best thing to do. And on top of that, do we have another picture here? Yeah, this is the other thing. Who is that dude there with the paddle? What saint is he? Which saint is that?
St. Kyron.
Who is it?
St. Kyron.
It's not a saint. It's Charon. And that's the boat, and that's the river Styx. And he's taking the souls of the damned across the river Styx. Now this is brilliant psychology. Like, look at that guy's face. It's like, holy shit. It's over. I can't do anything. There's another picture, I don't think we have it here, but there's one guy, he's standing there and he's got one hand over one eye, and you can tell by looking at the eye, it's like, oh no. It's over. I'm going to hell. I mean, the psychology of this is absolutely brilliant. But they're saying, wait a minute, this is pagan mythology. Why is that in a chapel? So you can see this crisis is building. It's partly to do with mimesis. It's partly to do with the pagan influences. Where are we going with this? Well, we found out in 1527, the German mercenaries came to Rome, and they didn't get paid. And whenever mercenaries don't get paid, they get annoyed, and so they sacked Rome. And part of what they did when they sacked Rome was they stabled their horses in the Sistine Chapel. And we know they were art critics because there's another room where they carved the name Martin Luther on the wall. This is 1527. It's 10 years after his profession of faith. Go back to, we're not up to date. So they go back, and what happens here is that they go back to Germany, and suddenly we have a whole new crisis, the exact opposite of pornography, which is iconoclasm. So now there are people who are saying, all art is bad. All art is bad. It's the kind of, Protestants tend to be Judaizers. Okay? And so we're going back to this Judaic aversion to graven images, which the Muslims picked up. And now we got Muslim theology from basically William of Ockham, and we're predisposed toward. This is the age of devotionalism, okay, where you have this devotion to Christ, which is not really rooted in any type of logical, metaphysical principle. And so suddenly the church is confronted with a crisis. Like, what do we do now? What do we do? Do we throw the baby out with the bathwater? And the answer to that was the Council of Trent. And that's what we have there. The church fathers coming together in the Council of Trent. And this is Federico Borromeo on the right. And he basically writes a treatise, the document that gets issued as a statement on sacred art. And so sacred art is necessary because we're creatures, we're of flesh. We have bodies. We exist in nature. And so therefore we're moved by the senses. Aquinas said all your knowledge comes through the senses. Now, that's not a bad thing, but you have this cripple, this concupiscence, this tendency always to take it in the wrong way. And so there's this battle here. Who's going to win at it? Are we going to have this completely iconoclastic view where no art whatsoever and just the Bible, we just read the Bible? Or are we going to have pornography? Which is, you're always being confronted with choices like this, especially now. It's like when Queen Elizabeth dies, okay? You have this lady, this professor somewhere saying, I hope she had an excruciating death. Well, that's awful to say that. But that leads right to Tucker Carlson, who then defends the British Empire as benign. No, my Irish relatives would beg to differ. But you see what I'm saying here? You're always confronted with two equally repugnant alternatives, and this is the classic example of those equally repugnant alternatives. So, what was it? The Council of Trent issues its statement, it rescues the whole thing, that's great. Okay, so what is the reaction of our separated brethren? Well, it was called, started in Holland, started in Antwerp, and it was called the Beldensturm, from the German word Bilderstürmerei, which is their word for iconoclasm. So, as if in defiant response to the Council's decree on art, a mob of Dutch Calvinists, German Anabaptists, and English soccer hooligans, no, actually they weren't, attacked, they were English though, attacked the cathedral in Antwerp on August 20th, 1566, igniting a wave of iconoclasm known as the Beldensturm, which swept north and east, all but obliterating the patrimony of sacred art in the Netherlands. According to Richard Clough, a Welsh Protestant merchant living in Antwerp at the time, the Church of Our Lady looked like hell, with about 10,000 torches burning and such a noise as if heaven and earth had gotten together, with falling of images and beating down of costly works, such sort that spoil was so great that a man could not well pass through the church. So that in fine and short, I cannot write to you this number of sheets of paper, the strange sight I saw there, organs and all destroyed. Nicholas Sander, an English Catholic exile who was professor of theology in Leuven, witnessed the destruction of the same church and stood there helplessly as these fresh followers of this new preaching threw down the graven and defaced the painted images not only of Our Lady, but of all others in the town. They tore the curtains, dashed in pieces the carved work of brass and stone, brake the altars, spoiled the cloths and corpses, wrested the irons, conveyed away, or sparing not the glass and seats which were made about the pillars of the church for men to sit in. The blessed sacrament of the altar they trod under their feet, and horrible to say, shed their stinking piss upon it. These false brethren burned and rent not only all kinds of church books, but moreover destroyed whole libraries of books, all sciences and tongues, yea, the holy scriptures of the ancient fathers, and tore in pieces the maps and charts of the descriptions of the country. If you've been through the 60s, you probably remember that it was the Catholics who did that to the churches back then. The Council of Trent's document on sacred art, combined with the iconoclasm in 1566, awakened new interest in art theory. And one of the men who responded to this challenge was Peter Paul Rubens. That painting is the response to both pornography and iconoclasm. Now, I saw that painting in person. It was at the Toledo Museum of Art. And when I got there to see it, I went 5 hours to get it because the line was so long. So, first time I look at, there's the 50s room, and that's abstract expressionism, and that's all abstract forms. Doesn't make any sense, and it's not alive. There's nothing living about that. It's just a design. Then I went to the 70s room, and that was all photographic, basically, hyperrealism, where you basically project a photograph on the wall and you color it in. And there are two extremes. The one is form without life, the other one's life without form. And then you walk down and you finally get into the Rubens exhibit, and this is the first thing you see. And when I walked in there, I stood there and I was just transfixed, because this is beauty. This is one of the most stunning portraits I've ever seen in my life. And why is that? Well, I can talk about it, but basically, remember all those discussions we had about all those triangles and whatever? Is this Platonic? Is there a Platonic form of the Princess Spinola Doria somewhere? No. Is it related to those forms? Of course it is. And if you look long enough, well, you can see this is a triangle, isn't it? And it culminates in a circle. And so the geometry's there, but it's real. So it's organized and it's real. It's unified, it's unity in diversity, and when you look at that something, that's beautiful. And that's the story up to that point. Thank you. We're going to have questions and answers. I will answer any question you have. Yes, sir.
Can you comment on how your thesis applies to music? Or
Yes.
any particular?
Yes, if you invite me back next year, I will show you. Because that's the second part of the book. And if you don't want to wait until next year, buy the book. Then you can read about it. But basically, I mentioned it already. So I mentioned the triad. The triad is a chord. That's 3 separate notes that are in one. That's an image of the Trinity. And so Pythagoras had all these ideas about music as representing something spiritual. Okay, well it is, it's true. But this is a different kind of mimesis. And the mimesis here is we're talking about something that takes place in time that you cannot see. And because it takes place in time, it's really what Aristotle was talking about in his Poetics when he talks about drama. Because there is drama in music. And there's drama in the scale. Especially the diatonic scale, because you get to the 7th note and you have to go to the 8th. It has to be resolved. There is something about music that demands this type of resolution. And so it's analogous, if we're talking about nature, simply on that term alone, it's like, we're talking about mimesis of movements of the soul. That's what music talks about. And it goes directly to the soul. And so you can have an experience, like, I row on the St. Joe River. And it's a great experience. You start off on a dock, and that's the first note, that's the the note that begins the scale here. And you're going along, and everything's fine, and then suddenly the weather changes, and you get to Mishawaka, and a thunderstorm rolls in, and suddenly you're scared to death. And you think, I'm going to die. And then finally the storm passes, you get back to the dock, and you're released. Well, that's catharsis, that's drama, and that's music. And if you want to talk about an actual example of music, talk about Beethoven's Sixth Symphony. Because there's a thunderstorm in the middle of Beethoven's Sixth Symphony. And that's the type of, but there's a long story before you get to Beethoven. He was an incredible advance in mimesis when it comes to music. So there's an Italian a violin concerto by Vivaldi called Tempesto Amaro, the Storm at Sea. Well, it's not really a storm at sea. Because he didn't have the mimetic ability that Beethoven had. Once Beethoven did the Sixth Symphony, all sorts of things opened up. You had a tremendous outburst of creativity in the 19th century. And so you had Rossini. There's a storm in Wilhelm Tell Overture. There's a storm there. You know, with a thunderstorm in it. And then you come to Swan Lake, and the finale of Swan Lake, there's a storm there. So I'm saying this is how mimesis develops. It's more complicated than that, but that's why you need to read the book. Because I may die. The world may end before. I hate to leave your name. Yes, who's next? Yes.
Just wanted to locate some things, Mike. Thanks for your wonderful lecture. Chronologically, the Council of Trent. Tell me if I'm right. Run by the Jesuits, basically. Was it?
No.
No? Okay, we'll leave that. 1500s?
Yeah, the late 16th century.
Okay, late 16th century.
It was started, and then it got stopped, and then it started up again.
Right, do that. Now, I want to link that somehow, or you help me, of course, with iconoclasm in my theological education. Justinian and Theodora. And when was that?
That's their church fathers. So we're talking, there was iconoclasm, periods of iconoclasm took place in various places.
Right.
The Muslims were iconoclasts. There was iconoclasm in Byzantium. Generally, it's a Judaizing tendency.
Huh?
So whenever you have Judaizers in the church, they hate images and they break the images because it's anti-incarnation.
So somehow images are not seen as vehicles of the Spirit at all.
No, they're seen as temptations. And I'm saying, look, if I had been a German mercenary, I walked into the Sistine Chapel, I would have been shocked. Because the cardinals were shocked. So if they're shocked, there was no one who had a more sophisticated education than Federico Borromeo. He had this is the culmination of the Italian tradition, the Italian art tradition, where they achieved things that no one had ever come close to before that. And he was part of that, and even he was shocked. He did it, I don't have it here. There was a portrait of Tisha did of Mary Magdalene. So there's Mary Magdalene, and there's a bare-breasted Mary Magdalene. And he said, look, bare breasts are appropriate at this point because they are symbolic of her former occupation. But she's got red eyes because she's been crying, so she's repenting that former occupation. And besides that, don't put it in the chapel. It's not fitting for the chapel. Pius X had the same thing to say about music. Okay, he said, I love opera, but it's not suitable for the Mass. And that meant, like, Beethoven's Mass is really not suitable. It's too grandiose, it's too distracting.
How about Mozart's?
No, sorry.
Oh.
He put it this way, I love Rossini,
Yeah.
but it's not appropriate for the liturgy.
Huh. This brings to
So the same thing about the chapel. It's beautiful art. You can have the bare-breasted Mary Magdalene in your private room, and when you pray, you can think about repentance and their former way of life, and that would be great. But don't put it in the chapel. It's too scandalous.
I hear that, but some modern dialogue is coming to mind from the, quote, my friends in the Protestant fundamentalist realm. Very easily, they say that's pagan, meaning it's not godly. Is that some type of echo of what you've been describing?
Yeah, what's wrong with being pagan? I mean, whenever they say this type of thing, I say, well, what about the prologue to the Gospel of St. John? Is that pagan?
It comes out of the Ephesian mysteries there at Ephesus.
No, it doesn't. It comes out of the metaphysical tradition that had been established by Plato and Aristotle.
Okay.
This is the cutting edge of logos in human history. That's Plato and Aristotle. God is not going to turn his back on a noble effort like that. He's not going to say, no, sorry. No, that was a great achievement because they came up with the word logos. That's a very important word. We still don't have a word like logos. And so, first of all, God is the author of human history. So then it says God inspired Plato and Aristotle to talk this way. So why is he going to turn his back on what he inspired? This is just a stupid kind of narrow-minded about pagan. Oh, pagan. My family was pagan at a certain point.
Yeah.
So was yours. So was yours. We all came from pagans at some point. So you're going to spit on your ancestors because they didn't have the benefit of the gospel? I used to say to my Iranian friends, my German ancestors were chasing pigs through the forest when the Persians were philosophers and astronomers. There's what I'm saying here is, there are moments in history where you simply cannot explain what's going on. Or whether it's too dangerous. As with the Persians, they found out because they were conquered by these camel jockeys, the Arabs. And it became dangerous to be a philosopher. So what did they do? They all became poets. And they created the greatest poetry, some of the greatest poetry in the world, with Hafez and Ferdowsi. And that's how they carried Logos forward in Persia under this Arabic hegemony. So don't despise. It's beauty. Beautiful poem. And so the inside, you get to know a Persian or the Arabian. If you know him well, he'll say, take you aside and say, look, this is Ferdowsi. Ferdowsi is the greatest poet in Iranian history. And he felt that Islam was the biggest catastrophe that ever happened to his country. And that is being nurtured through poetry. And that's not, we're going to have to come to a reckoning with it. That's a long story. Next question. Yes, sir.
I know you're not the biggest fan of Hegel, but it strikes that a lot of what you're talking about with this sort of the dynamic between divine and worldly and mediator Christ fits into like a dialectical description.
Right.
Do you agree? I guess.
Yes.
Yes.
And I am a big fan of Hegel.
Okay. I remember.
In spite of his problems. So you're talking about the transition between part 2 of my book and part 3 of my book. Okay, because there are 3 people were born in 1770. More than 3 people actually, but 3 important. Beethoven, Hegel, and Wordsworth. And what you're seeing with Hegel and Beethoven is the same reaction to the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times. And who embodied the spirit of the times at that point for both of these people? It was Napoleon. So the Third Symphony is about Napoleon. Beethoven's Third Symphony is about Napoleon. But it's not like, and Napoleon showed up here. It's about the emotions that Europeans felt as Napoleon is breaking down the old order. He's a genius of doing that. Hegel was in Jena when Napoleon came riding through. And what they have in common, what Hegel and Beethoven and Wordsworth have in common, is the dialectic. The dialectic is in the Sixth Symphony. It's mimesis, but what is the dialectic? You begin with something that's real but unconscious. This is when you're a child. And then you become an adolescent, when you become conscious, but you're not real. You've got all these ideas, but nothing has happened. And then you finally become an adult, which is usually when you get married. And then it's both real and conscious at the same time. That's the dialectic. This is what happens with Beethoven's Sixth Symphony. It starts off, Beethoven enters nature. Okay, it's beautiful walking through nature because nature is redeemed, it's a place, refuge from the city, and then he comes across the peasants who are dancing. Da 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 da, sort of kind of rhythmic thing, and they're dancing and dancing, and suddenly what happens? The thunderstorm rolls in, and suddenly chaos threatens everything. And now what are we going to do? We're all going to die, but maybe not. And then suddenly the thunderstorm passes away. And so we've had confronted with adversity, just like the Fifth Symphony. You're confronted with adversity, you overcome adversity, and now you're on a higher level. And I can't hum that part, I forget that. That's the end of the symphony, where suddenly, this is the dialectic. This is the way Logos, this is the way God works in human history. And all of these people are understanding. The other analogy would be Wordsworth's poem, Daffodils, which is the same type of thing. They're all coming together. It's all based on mimesis, but in different forms. So no, I am a fan of Hegel. He's got his problems, but this was the zeitgeist at that point, and it led to another outburst of creativity, which is the music that had begun in the 18th century with people like Mozart, Vivaldi, all the way up to the 20th century. And then I talk about how it all went to hell in a handbasket, and that's part 4. Yes? Yes, sir.
So going back to the beginning of the lecture, talking about the development of Plato's dualism and the forms, and I believe you used the word becoming at one point. And you have like chaos and like becoming, and then you have on the other hand like the form of the thing. So I just wanted to ask if you could elaborate a little more on that, and then how you talked about how Aquinas basically like reversed and perfected that.
Yeah, so there were 2 realms for Plato. Time and eternity. And eternity was the realm of geometrical figures or forms, and time was meaningless flux. What happened because he didn't understand there was creation. So now you have the Christian idea of creation, and when you have the Christian idea of creation, there is Logos in creation. We can call it matter if you want. That's what matter was formless. But if you want to call it whatever it is out there, it's not just formless matter. There's a Logos to it. There is a reasonableness to it. There is a form to it. And all you have to do is study the form. This is what Aquinas said. The form, you can derive the form from nature. You don't have to impose it on nature. It's like, I said it was like the difference between Crisis magazine and Culture Wars magazine. Crisis magazine had a form at the beginning. It was called conservatism. And that got imposed on the magazine, and that meant everything had to fit into that Procrustean day of conservatism. I didn't have a clear idea of what it was that I was starting. And so I just started doing articles. And the more articles I did, the more the big picture started to do. You see the difference? That's the difference that Aquinas brought about in art and aesthetics. That's the difference. So just a recent example, I spent a week in Brad Pitt's bachelor pad in Carmel, California. That's the way it was described when he completed the sale. I knew the people who owned it before that. They invited me out as their last. It's a kind of sad thing. But it's the most beautiful house. You can Google it. I should have a picture. Actually, I do have a picture. Go all the way to the end. Of me in Brad Pitt's bachelor pad. There I am. This is called the D.L. James House. It's in Carmel Highlands, California. And it is one of the most, I talked about Bavaria as a place where there's this perfect match between nature and culture. But there's no building in Bavaria that does it better than this house. And so this was created by the man who created the bungalow. This is the cliff. I'm looking out over the Pacific Ocean, which is a stunning view. And this is the house. So D.L. Green creates the bungalow in Pasadena. He basically priced himself out of the market. He doesn't know what to do. He shows up at an artist colony in Carmel. And a guy comes up to him and said, I just bought this property. Can you build a house? So what did he do? What did Charles Green do? He went there and he camped out there for a year. Now he had studied architecture at MIT in Boston in the 1890s. And that meant the Beaux-Arts tradition, which meant you build a Greek temple wherever you went. And he decided, there I am, there's the background. That's what I'm looking at. That's behind me, that's the Pacific Ocean. I don't think he ever read Aquinas. Why would anyone read Aquinas in Boston in 1890? That's not what they were reading. They were studying the Beaux-Arts tradition, which had beautiful buildings, McKim, Mead, and White, the train station in Washington, D.C., the University Club. They're beautiful buildings, but they're Greek temples. And he said, no, this is in America. Why are we living in Greek temples? And so he sat there, and what happened here is exactly what Aquinas said. Existence called forth essence. The landscape called forth a building. There was a building waiting to be built there that would arise seamlessly out of the landscape, and that's it. So this is not typical. He didn't do stone. He did wooden buildings and lots of redwood. But this is what this landscape demanded. So there was a quarry down the road, and he quarried all those stones. And not only that, he sat there and supervised the construction of every single wall. Now, what architect is ever going to do that? That's absolutely crazy. But he was a perfectionist, and if they did it wrong and he was away, he'd come back, tear it down, and do it over again. You created, if you go back to that, no, go back to the window. That's the kitchen window. You look out over the Pacific. Every view in that is a work of art. Every part of the building is a work of art, and every time you're in a particular place, so Carmel that's the Pacific Ocean, it's freezing cold, and it dominates the climate, so sometimes the sun's out and then the fog rolls in. The fog rolls in, you want to go inside, you need a different experience, you have this type of experience, this type of intimacy. This is all, I'm saying this is Thomistic, and I'm sure that guy never knew what it meant. I'm saying this is an idea that is out there in the ether. It changed the world, and we all understand it, even if we don't know where we got it. Yes, sir.
Were they brothers, Dr. Jones, the Green Brothers?
Yeah.
And they designed furniture as well.
Absolutely. They were part of the arts and crafts movement.
Yes.
So they reached the pinnacle of their success was in Pasadena from around 1909 up until this was built in 1918. Look at that. Isn't that stunning? If you get another thing you have to do before you read is subscribe to Culture Wars magazine, because there's a picture on the cover. Like I never felt that photography was art. Okay, like you can't take a picture of the Wilhelmsdorf Venus. That's the mind creating something. But this lady, we were standing there, Ruth and I were standing there as the sun's going down, and this lady took a picture in exactly the right moment. And it's a work of art. But the reason it's a work of art is because you've got imitation of nature there. This building is imitation of nature. It's the culmination. Man is the culmination of nature. Man is supreme. The Logos is the culmination of nature. You can apprehend nature, and you can bring it to perfection in a way that nature cannot do it itself. And that's exactly what that house is. Look at that house. Look at that. That's a work of art, simply by, you're surrounded, you're living in a work of art. This is culture. That's nature. There's a seamless transition between the two of them. And you perceive that simultaneous perception of existence, which is nature, and essence, which is culture to some extent, perfect coming together of that. And you see it as beauty, and you get to live in beauty. I hope Brad Pitt appreciates this. The woman who had the lead had herself sent him a copy of my article. Well, I hope he takes it to heart. Yes, sir.
You touched a little bit earlier about the icons in Greece, and I wanted to get your thoughts on the icon versus the traditional Roman Catholic art perspective. There have been very few innovations with icons throughout the centuries. You know, what's happening today in 21st century Russia is really pretty much the same as what Andrei Rublev did back during the time. Why do you think, or do you have an opinion as to why the innovations never came to the East, whereas they definitely came to the Roman Catholic side, for better or for worse, mostly for worse?
Yeah. I think the crucial issue is the Council of Florence, where the Medici sponsored the council. The head of Byzantium, the Turks are heading toward Byzantium. We need to resolve this because the West has to send armies to defend Byzantium. So they had the Council of Florence, and they resolved the issue, separated. One of them was the filioque clause. If you want my humble opinion, the main reason art does not develop there is the filioque clause. Because the filioque clause means that God, the Holy Spirit, God proceeds from God the Father and the Son. That's dynamic. That's the kind of Trinitarian dynamism that led to this type of thing. If it's just from God the Father, it doesn't have that dynamism. I'm going to be speaking tomorrow to a bunch of Orthodox kids who, I mean, we're going to be the only Catholic there. I'm going to bring this up, but they lynch me. But I think I have to be, because the fundamental question is, why was the West so dynamic and why was the East so static? So the Bessarion came back from Russia. They resolved the issue. He goes back to Russia, and the clergy won't accept it. They rejected him. So he went back and he said, all right, I'll become a Catholic. Why was, this is the big issue. It's an apostolic church. It's not a Protestant church. If you go back to the councils that hammered out the Trinity, you could not do this unless you spoke Greek. This was Greek philosophy. It came down to two words, homoousion and homoiousion. One letter difference. God is one in being or like God, like the Father. That discussion could only take place in Greek. The Latin fathers were completely excluded. And over the period of the next 1,000 years, it just became stratified, or it just stopped developing. And I think it was the break with, first of all, communion with Rome. Secondly, the filioque clause. And thirdly, ethnocentrism. And that's why they're different. That's why the icon. That's why they still do icons. Yes.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes.
You mentioned we're always presented with two equally repugnant alternatives. Mentioning the Carlson and the Cleveland with that comment, and also with reference to iconoclasm and pornography. It seems that way in the culture generally, even politically, socially, because in so much of life we're presented with this duality. And for a thinking person, a lot of times they seem equally repugnant. So I guess my question, as far as, like, it seems that's the image of Christ I have. He's between these two extremes, and he's the middle way. So it's not so much a question, it's kind of just a comment, like, as far as a creator, I'm an artist myself, what are some other traditions, you mentioned the Persian poetry, to like, how can artists speak to this moment in American history in a way that recognizes the dark past of America, but it's not woke, that throws the baby out with the bathwater and goes completely full bore, just insane. Like, what is a sensible way that comes from a Christian-centered tradition, but that is imaginative and that can speak to the culture? What are some books or artists or traditions that could really speak to that moment?
Yeah, well, I can't tell you that because that's an individual thing that someone's going to have to create on its own. I can't tell you how to do it. But I can tell you, if it's going to be beauty, it's got to be organized and it's got to be real. Because you have to do that. So I've been thinking about this from another perspective. I spent time in Germany. I mentioned Persia was a time where if you got philosophical or discursive, addressed it directly, you would get your head chopped off. Another example was Elizabethan, exactly the same situation. Shakespeare could not talk about the contemporary situation because it was a police state and it was drawn in quarter. So what he had to do, he had to write about Timon of Athens. When he's writing about Athens, he's really writing about it. The same thing is happening right now in Germany, right now. Germany is a complete police state, it's a completely tyrannical state. And if you tell the truth about certain things, you go to jail. And I'm saying at this moment in time, what we need is art. And this is precisely what I'm trying to propose, trying to bring some pieces together. So that I know a composer, I was friendly with him in the 70s. He's composing things, he's in a dead end because he can't deal with the situation. We're going to have to deal with the situation. We can't deal with it directly. Music is the ideal thing because Germans love music. And you're not saying anything in music. You're describing the emotions. So I'm saying we need to do a piece of music that addresses this situation. I can't tell you it's music from. I don't know. But I know what it's got to be. It's got to be real. In other words, you have to be talking about this situation, even though you can't talk about it literally. You get thrown in jail, but we have to address, because of that, you have to address the situation. So in some sense, that's what Beethoven did when he talked about Napoleon in the Third Symphony. Okay? We're going to have to deal with that now. Only art can address this issue in Germany. You cannot address it specifically. Yes, sir?
You mentioned something earlier about how photography you didn't consider it art, and even in your lecture you mentioned how there can be a hyper realism to certain pieces when people are trying to portray whatever image it is that they want the audience to see. Could you expand on that a little bit, and maybe also give your opinion on the recent portraits of Obama and his wife? Because I believe the artist who drew Obama's portrait was trying to make it look as lifelike as possible.
Sure.
And, you know, like growing up as a child,
you have to do that.
Right.
Have you ever taken a picture of someone and the person says, "That's not me"? I type it to me all the time. Who's that ugly dude? Oh, it's me. No, that's not really me. Well, there is a way, in a sense, in which the artist captures the real you. How do we know? Is there a typical, like, you get to know the person, there's some type of typical gesture that that person has, and you catch the moment. You catch that. The camera can't do that. I mean, if you have the picture of Logos, the cover of Logos Rising is, okay, remember I said I rode on the St. Joe River? So what's that a picture of? There's no camera that can take that picture. It's based on reality. So what's the reality? Well, that's the St. Joe River. And when I row in the summer, and I turn around at Mishawaka, I'm facing east, and that's what the sun looks like coming up over the river. But when I go in the wintertime, I take a walk because in the winter it's too cold to row, and I walk down at twilight, and I walk down a path, and there are buildings on either side, and at twilight you can see the lights coming on. So it's two completely different seasons. There's no way you can do that. There's no camera that can do that. That image exists in my mind. It was my grandson who did it. He graduated from Temple, Tyler School, Temple University. But it was the mind. Only the mind can imitate nature. A photograph can't. So if you look at that picture on the cover of this month's Culture Wars, what you're seeing is the beauty of nature combined with the beauty of that building at a moment when the sun is going down and the sunlight suffuses the entire portrait, gives a kind of unity to it, simply because of the light. And then there's a psychological drama in this thing as well. Namely, me and my wife are standing there looking at the sunlight, and she's looking up, and the sun illuminates her face, and I'm looking down, and my face is in kind of shadow. So it's like the hopeful view of the future and the kind of the melancholy thinking of the past, because that's the kind of person. But the genius there was, first of all, Charles Green, who gave us the environment, God, who gave us the Pacific Ocean, and Allegra, who took the picture, who pressed the button at exactly the right time. None of those, that camera could not do that by itself. So a camera is not mimesis. It's a reproduction, it's a mechanical reproduction. Only the mind can reproduce, can imitate nature. Yes, sir.
Do you see a connection between the loss of our sense of supernatural reality and the appreciation of beauty in our modern culture?
Of course. Of course I do.
Can you expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, of course I do. We live in a world that is deliberately, first of all, when you get to the 20th century, they abandoned mimesis. Art abandoned mimesis. I'm saying for financial reasons, because as soon as you abandon mimesis, here's Jack the Dripper. He did this painting, Jackson Pollock. Here it is. Have I got a painting for you?
That's $100.
Wait a minute. What's this? I don't understand. No, this is the up-and-coming thing. If you buy this, it will be worth 10 times its weight in gold within 6 years. So what's art become? As soon as the dealer takes over the art world, it's insider trading. Well, of course, if every rich dude in New York and Manhattan bought a picture like this, which is exactly what happened, Nelson Rockefeller started buying these things and putting them up in Chase Manhattan banks, the value went up. So it's not beauty, it's insider trading. And now, wait a minute, it's hanging upside down. Wait a minute. No, you can't tell whether it's hanging upside down or right side up. But you trust the dealer. The dealer now holds all the cards. And so what happened is, Mr. Kahnweiler showed up. He's a German Jew, shows up in Paris, and he creates Cubism. He created Picasso. Because Picasso, who's going to buy Picasso? And this is for Sayers. Would you buy this? Who are these people? Look at that chick. She's cute, isn't she? That's an African mask. Okay, this is called, she's got a cute armpit, doesn't she? She looks like a baboon. This is called a Damsel d'Avignon. It is based, the Calle d'Avignon was the red light district in Barcelona where it grew up. And so there are 3 whores. Does that make a difference? What about Etienne Gilson? Oh no, it's just forms. No, it isn't. It's 3 whores. This is a deliberately transgressive piece of art. There's an attack on the mimetic tradition of the West, and it was the art dealer, Kahnweiler, who perpetrated that on everyone. And this is where the story of the 20th century. These people take over. Leo Castelli was the same thing in New York. And so this is aggressive. This is transgression. And Picasso got rich on that type of transgression. Yes, sir?
Yeah, I wonder if you could just comment on America a little bit. Like, for example, I see this great polarity. I think we've globalist here in charge. We boss Europe around. We've got Jeffrey Sachs in the Vatican. And yet I also see sparks of the preservation of Christendom in the United States, including you. And thank you so much for what you've done. And I think you're being spread around. You're becoming more popular. So I also see some of the princes of the church very associated with the United States, Archbishop Athanasius Schneider, Cardinal Burke, Archbishop Vigano, etc. So I see this polarity. I just wonder if you could comment on that and what you're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, basically I said that this is America is a tragic adventure. That's from Hemingway. He said, it's in Big Two-Hearted River. Fishing in the swamp is a tragic adventure. America is a tragic adventure because who owned the house? A guy named Joe Ritchie. A guy who was a master of the universe, a gambler who made a ton of money at the Chicago Board of Trade and decided, I'm going to do good. And then, beware when you start to think you're going to do good. You think, that's classical America. I'm going to be the innocent, I'm going to do good, I'm going to bring the people together. It ended up differently. The same thing with Charles Green. Charles Green said, I'm not going to do the good, I'm going to do the beautiful. And he did, but he went broke. Well, that's America. It's like where we are. This is a beautiful house. Thank God that John Haas rescued this beautiful house. Because if we look at all the houses that I passed through coming up here, up Lancaster Avenue and 52nd Street. What happened here? What happened here? This is a tragedy. This is a tragedy. There is this spirit, there is this American spirit. We have to carry it on. What was Philadelphia famous for? Digby Baltzell wrote a book comparing Philadelphia and Boston. Boston, they had ideas, they talked to each other. Philadelphia, nobody could talk to anybody because it was run by Quakers. And you can't talk to a Quaker. The Catholic Church has one person that's infallible, known as the Pope. Every Quaker is infallible. Because when they go to their services, the Holy Spirit speaks directly to you. You want to argue with the Holy Spirit? I tried, believe me. I tried to talk to Ed Bacon, the man who created Penn Center. But you can paint pictures, and that's what Philadelphia was famous for, the fine arts in Philadelphia. And now you've got anti-fine. Who was talking to me? Was it you who were talking to me about the girl who de-skilling?
Oh, yeah.
Going to art school to unlearn all the skills that she learned. Art, this is crazy. We've got lunatics who have taken over the asylum here. We are in a position where these people have their hands on the steering wheel and the car is heading toward a cliff. And we all know what I'm talking about. The war in the Ukraine, the threat of nuclear war, Larry Krasner not prosecuting crimes, the zombies walking around on Kensington Avenue. My wife and I came from Fishtown. Our families came from Fishtown. Shows you our aristocratic background. Fishtown was the working class. They were people who worked there. Her father ran a little Episcopalian church. My first wife was an Episcopalian. That's my first wife, and she was an Episcopalian. And this little church, when this guy was a mechanic, this was the genius of places like Philadelphia. They had mechanics, Detroit, the thing that made Detroit famous, working for building cars and ships. He could fix anything. And when he died, that went out of the church ceased to exist, and a whole generation passed. And now we're in this mess. So how are we going to get out of it? The best way, the fastest way out of it is beauty. If you can put someone in a beautiful environment, that person, especially a young person, talking about young people particularly, this is why literature is important when you're in high school, because it's accessible, it's concrete. If you can convince that person that the world is not only orderly, but that it's beautiful, that person will be more likely to lead a moral life. And if the more likely he is to lead a moral life, the more successful that man's life will be. And he will enter heaven afterwards after a successful life on this earth. That is the whole point of civilization. And that's what our struggle is right now. And it can begin with beauty. It can begin with beauty in your home. You know? It would be nice if the whole city were beautiful. It was beautiful. This is beautiful. It's the best place. I can't think of a better place to hold this talk, because we're surrounded by beauty here, and this is the world that was once our world, and God willing, we can return to it. That's my hope. Thank you.
By Dr. Jones, including Slaughtered Cities, pornography related to Philadelphia, and we have some wine. And thank you so much for coming tonight. And how about one last hand for Dr.
But why wine? Why not orleans?
Thank you.